Hello, how are you doing? I'm continuing on looking at some of the best books of the year lists, and today it's really fun group of lists actually, of authors that have been recommending their best books of the year, and I always find this really fun to peruse, especially if it's an author I really like, seeing what they have really enjoyed over the past year. Obviously, authors have much more idiosyncratic choices than critics. Often they'll be picking backlisted books or books just on specialty subjects that they're interested in. And it's really interesting to see if I agree with them or don't agree with them. And then if I don't agree with some of their choices, if that slightly changes my opinion of the author themselves, there's always the risk of that. Obviously a lot of different newspapers and publications will get authors to recommend some of their best books of the year. So I'm just looking at a few, and I'm just looking at some select authors that I'm especially interested in from these articles. So I'll put links down in the description below to all of these articles if you want to have a good long look through to see if there's other, because there's lots more recommendations which I'm not going to talk about because then this would go on forever. But I'm going to pick out some very particular choices, starting off with the New Statesman and a number of different authors that they selected. And first off, Hilary Mantel and her choices for the year. And she first off picks a memoir by Musa Okwonga called One of Them, which is about a young black man that went to study at Eton University, a very privileged elite university that's predominantly white and produces a lot of politicians, and how he was realizing that he was the recipient of a lot of privilege from going there, but that actually his feelings about the larger consequences for society because of this very elite institution are very different. And Hilary Mantel comments that it sheds light on the present disconnect between those who govern and those who suffer the consequences. And she also recommends a new short novel called Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which I just read recently and really agree with. It's such a powerful novel about an Irish town in the mid-80s and a sort of secret within that town. And she writes that it wastes not a word. And I completely agree. It is such a short book, but it is so powerful. Next there is Bernardine Evaristo. And it's also really interesting to see in looking at different lists from different publications if there's the same author there and if that author is recommending the same books or different books, if they use it as an opportunity to pick out different books. And it's there are some of these authors there, and Bernardine appears on more than one list, and she recommends different books across the different lists. The first book she recommends is she actually recommends two collections of poems. First one I've never heard of, called C+nto and othered poems. Sorry, I'll put up a cover of this so you can see what it actually is. And this is by Joelle Taylor. And I'd not heard of this before. She says that she's produced one of the most astonishing and original poetry collections of recent years, that it's partly autobiographical exploration of the lives of butch lesbian counterculture. And it's interesting to get that suggestion from Bernardine Evaristo, because I read Evaristo's memoir this year, in which she talks quite frankly about her sexuality, and that's really interesting. And she also recommends Poor by Caleb Femi, which is a poetry collection I've been really wanting to get to reading this year, and just haven't got to yet. And she says that it zooms in on the lives of young black men on the South London housing estate of his own childhood. I'm hoping to read that at some point. Then there is Damon Galgut, the winner of this year's Booker Prize, so has been probably much in demand for blurbs and quotes to give to books to help promote them. And he is somebody that also also appears on multiple lists, but recommends the same books. And so I have a feeling that this is very much a just sort of copy and paste for him that he probably sent to multiple publications. And I don't really blame him for that, because not everyone wants to spend the time like writing out endless recommendations, and I'm sure he's much in demand. But anyway, the first book he recommends is also Claire Keegan's novel. So as I say with these lists, it's interesting to see which books pop up multiple times. I'm having really trouble with P words today. Pop up multiple times to be picked in multiple, anyway. And and Claire Keegan's novel has been appearing a lot recently, and which I really agree with. And he says, he describes it as absolutely exquisite. Her work is exceptional, and he also recommends Burntcoat by Sarah Hall. We're having really trouble speaking today, which I've not read yet, but he says she's a marvelous writer. She used the scenario of an unnamed plague and the lockdown it sets to create a psychological mystery. And it feels like we have been getting a lot of lockdown novels, and we'll probably continue to be getting them as more writers respond to the events of the past almost 2 years now, and which is, I think, completely natural. Now, this recommendation from Lucy Hughes Hallett is really interesting, because she was one of the judges of the International Booker Prize this year, and in her recommendation she sheds a little light on books that didn't make their list but which she thought should have. She first off, she picks off the book A Perfect Cemetery by Federico Falco, which she calls a collection of haunting, witty stories by the Argentinian writer, and also Philippe Claudel's Dog Island, which I don't think I have heard of. She calls it a parable about modern migrations that is also the kind of detective story that Mikhail Bulgakov might have written, visionary and darkly humorous. But she also recommends as her favorite novel of the year a backlisted book, which was newly reprinted this year, called O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker, which is a gothic Scottish story that I've been really wanting to read as well. There's the author Mark Haddon, who recommends The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., which I also agree with is such an excellent, moving, really epic, sweeping story that I found so involving and emotional. He calls it a gripping, luminous novel about the many tangled lives of a Louisiana plantation, centering on two enslaved teenage lovers, Samuel and Isaiah. Reviews invoking Toni Morrison were absolutely justified. And he also recommends a nonfiction book, which I think sounds really interesting, called The Idea of the Brain by Matthew Cobb, which he describes as a thrilling history of our rapidly expanding understanding of the brain. And I would really love to read more books sort of exploring the brain and neuroscience and the whole crazy science of that. Ali Smith has some recommendations, which gives me a little heartbreak looking at Ali Smith's name, because I just found out recently, because of ongoing issues to do with the pandemic, I'm not going to be able to do an event which was planned for early next year, where I was going to be interviewing Ali Smith in a live event at a literary festival, and I was so looking forward to it, so excited about it, but it's totally understandable that people are delaying physical events, because things are still so uncertain, so hopefully it will actually happen at some point, but that's an event that I was really looking forward to next year, which is just going to be delayed. But anyway, so of course Ali recommends some slightly more obscure books. She says A Look at My Life, which is a memoir by Eileen Agar, and she describes it as hard to get, and I did go look online to see if copies of this would be available. Is from 1988, and I couldn't find a copy for much under £100. And so, yeah, it would be very expensive to try to get a copy of this book. I mean, might have a look in some libraries if you want to read it. But she describes it as as what a book, spirited, funny, candid, as irreverent, textured, and cornucopic as her art. It begins, "Head first, I tumbled out of my mother in December 1899. The book ends with, "I hope to die in a sparkling moment," which, yeah, is a fantastic way to begin and end a book. Yeah, she really knows how to sell a book, Ali Smith does. And she also mentions Jennifer Higgie's brilliant The Mirror and the Palette, which reveals an until now hidden history of women's self-portraiture and is pretty cornucopic itself. She seems to really like that word at the moment, cornucopic, describing the word cornucopia as an adjective. But she picks out as her book of the year a poetry collection called 40 Names by a young Afghani poet, Parwana Fayyaz, and quotes a line from it, which is, "No one ever wanted to know what the real story was. As clear as unruined water, as courageous as a poet can be in these times, as haunting as the brutal history it records, and as marvelously summoned as the lives it celebrates. It's a calm reclamation and a tour de force." Wow. Then we have a recommendation from Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland and a wonderful lover of literature. Actually, she has interviewed Ali Smith at the Edinburgh Book Festival before, which I wish I could have seen. I'm sure it would have been an amazing event. And Nicola Sturgeon recommends A Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, which of course I'm very happy about and completely agree with. She describes it as an epic tale of daring and adventure, which it totally is. And she also recommends The Magician by Colm Toibin, and which I'd been meaning to read for ages, about the life of Thomas Mann, and she describes it as another masterpiece. The rise of Nazi Germany and the horrors of the Second World War are viewed through the eyes and experiences of the complicated and multi-layered writer and Nobel Prize winner Thomas Mann, historical fiction at its best. I also wanted to mention that Colm Toibin just recently won the David Cohen Prize for Literature, which is sometimes termed as the UK Nobel Prize because it awards an author for their body of work rather than, just a single book, and it's quite a lucrative prize. But yeah, there'll be more recommendations from Toibin soon. Actually, why not just jump to his recommendations right now? So Toibin recommends some poetry. Derek Mahon's the poems from 1961 to 2020, which were published a year after the poet's death, and he says that it displays a rich talent, formalist and casual, witty and melancholy, minimalist and expansive. He also recommends Claire Keegan's novel Small Things Like These, so yeah, yet another recommendation for that book. He also recommends the works of Guillerme Dusan, Volume 1, which I've not heard of before, but he describes this as it containing 3 short, engrossing novels that center on sharp and acute descriptions of gay sex, the sensibility and inner world of the protagonist emerging richly by implication. This is a great book for gay boys on a winter night. I love that description. I'm gonna have to get a copy of that. There's also recommendations from Gary Yun, who was the chair of judges for the Portico Prize this year, which I just talked about in a video recently. He recommends Nadifa Mohammed's The Fortune Men, which I really loved this book. He describes it as an elegant portrayal of life in the racial cultural hub of Cardiff's Tiger Bay in the early 50s, eschewing a simple morality play for complex, vivid characters. It centers on the plight of Mahmoud Matan, who finds himself in the shadow of the hangman's noose for a murder he didn't commit. He also recommends The Windrush Betrayal by Amelia Gentleman, which he says sat on his shelf for far too long because I thought I knew the story. I didn't. At least I had not sat with it beyond the news cycles for the length of time necessary to witness the full scale of the injustice unfold in a single narrative thread, a book that keeps you informed and makes you angry. I'd really like to read that because, yeah, I'd really like to know more about the Windrush generation as well. Alif Shafak recommends a couple of books that I've not heard of before, and so she first starts with Hope Not Fear by Hassan Akkad. She describes it as an extraordinary story that deals with the urgent issues of our era, including the Syrian war, systematic torture, and dehumanization ongoing in countries where authoritarianism has taken hold. She also recommends a book called Burning the Books by Richard Ovenden, which I think maybe I've seen in some bookstores when I've been looking around, but who's the director of the Baudelaire Library. She says, this fascinating and moving book should be read at schools and translated into languages all around the world. In a digital age that abounds with snippets of information, this is a glorious celebration of physical libraries and nuanced knowledge. The author Melvin Bragg also recommends The Magician, and he says that this recreates as biographical fiction the life, thoughts, and achievements of Thomas Mann. It is dark, beautifully constructed, and I think as near as one author can get to entering the mind of another. And he also recommends Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, which he says boldly sets out to create an artificial friend. She is a robot with brilliantly realized human observations and convincingly emotions. It's wonderful. And yeah, I completely agree. It is so wonderful. And it's the really tricksy thing about it is you often forget that this girl narrator at the center of the book isn't human, and you continuously forget that, and what that says about emotions and our humanity itself. Also, the writer Rose Tremaine has some recommendations. She recommends Damon Galgutt's The Promise, and she says that he is the most worthy winner of the Booker Prize we've seen for many years. His novel The Promise turns around the pledge made by the Swartz, a white South African family, to grant ownership of a small house on their land to their long-suffering black maid Salome. The pledge is never kept, and the lives of the neglectful, quarrelsome Swartz fall into ruin. The book trembles in the hand with its political relevance. I think I'm able to hold this book pretty steady, but yeah, I completely agree that what this book says is still very relevant, especially in South Africa right now, as Damon Galgut insisted when he won the Booker Prize. Tremaine also recommends for a gripping reread, which is wonderful to see. You don't see enough recommendations of rereads that people have done over the course of the year. She says, Arnold Wesker's The Birth of Shylock and the Death of Zero Mostel, the story of how a production of Wesker's play The Merchant, masterpiece or dud, was assassinated on the New York stage. And yeah, that sounds like a really gripping story. And now I'm going to move on to some recommendations that were in the Guardian Observer from different authors, starting with Ishiguro himself, recommending first some fiction and then some much more politically engaged nonfiction. So he starts off with recommending Mariana Enriquez's The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which is a collection of short stories from which he describes as having disturbed adolescence, ghosts, decaying ghouls, the sad and angry homeless of modern Argentina is the most exciting discovery I've made in fiction for some time, which is quite a big statement to make. I don't totally agree with that. I didn't find those stories quite as effective. They're really creative and engaging, and some of them are quite moving. But yeah, as a whole, I didn't completely love that collection. but yeah, there you go. Then he also recommends some nonfiction, like I said. So Horrifying in Another Way, Jonathan Calvert and George Arbuthnot's Failures of State is a brilliantly presented indictment of the UK's fumbling attempt to meet the COVID challenge. Read alongside Jeremy Farrar's more personal Spike, the Virus v. the People, and Michael Lewis's compelling The Premonition. We see a disturbing common trait emerging in our country and others, the unwillingness to prioritize people's lives over ideas and ingrained structures. Then Bernardine Evaristo also has a section in this, but she recommends some books, different books than she recommended before, and here she picks some nonfiction choices as well. And so she's also been thinking a lot about British history and global history and culture and identity beyond the often distorted, dishonest, and pumped-up myth-making that has long prevailed. So she says history is an interpretation of the past in these 3 books, each one powerfully persuasive and offering new ways of seeing, are in conversation with each other, which is, a really interesting idea of books in conversation with each other, which is totally true. And, if you read a lot, then, you see that more and more often. So she recommends Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain by Sathnam Sangara, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World by Kendi Andrews, and Green Unpleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural England's Colonial Connections by Corinne Fowler. So those are some really interesting recommendations from her. Then there's a recommendation from Wole Soyinka, who's published this great big novel, which I still have to get to reading at some point this year. And he recommends Elif Shafak's new novel, The Island of Missing Trees, which is a novel I really enjoyed and loved as well, and which he says is tender and savage by turns in a Greco-Turkish Cypriot historic setting. The rigorous questioning of nation and identity, given my incessant preoccupations, made it a truly therapeutic literary meal, which is a wonderful way to describe a reading experience. Then Callum Toibin is back with some more book recommendations, and he says that he enjoyed Hugo Hamilton's The Pages, narrated with verve and ingenuity by an actual book, a novel by Joseph Roth, which got saved from the Nazi bonfire and then takes on a picaresque journey across the Atlantic and back to Germany. I also enjoyed the social historian Patrick Joyce's Going to My Father's House, a haunting meditation on Ireland and England, war and migration, Derry and Manchester. I admired the originality of his observations and his tone of melancholy, calm wisdom. And I love John McAuliffe's selected poems for the way that ordinary things are rendered and rhythm handled so deftly and artfully. I get the feeling that Callum reads a lot of poetry. Elif Shafak is also back with some more recommendations, and she recommends a couple of books that were listed for this year's Wainwright Prize, which I was following, and I read one of these books, which was Anita Sethi's I Belong Here. She describes it as an unforgettable journey. Sethi wrote this book after being the victim of a horrible racist attack on a train from Liverpool to Newcastle. The genius of the author is how she takes the narrative of hatred and discrimination hurled at her and turns it upside down by going back to where she came from, the landscapes of the North. Through long walks in nature, as she finds a true sense of belonging, connectivity, renewal, and hope, so do we, her readers. I found it not only deeply moving, but also quietly transformative. yeah, that's a wonderful way to describe that book, which is, yeah, such an excellent memoir. And also Anita Sethi was just announced recently as one of the judges for next year's Women's Prize for Fiction. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what she decides for her choices, like alongside the other judges for that prize. She also recommends Thin Places by Carrie Ni-Docte, which she describes as a fabulous read that stayed with me this year. And so Born in Derry at the height of the Troubles, the author's voice is piercingly honest, movingly heartfelt. There is so much soul and knowledge and compassion. It gave me shivers. Now, Sarah Hall has some recommendations as well. And first off, she recommends Sea State by Tabitha Lasley, which is a book I talked about recently as it's currently shortlisted for the Portico Prize. And she says it took her completely by surprise, part memoir, part investigation into oil rig culture, part critique of gender and class dynamics. It's incredibly compelling, often dark as the drilled for product. Lasley infiltrates this masculine offshore industry with its dangers, profit, and comradeship. She also explores female loneliness and desire, accommodation of a male-designated world, and the spaces where women hold power. Yeah, I think that's a really great description of it, and I might as well pick up the Portico Prize since I keep talking about it, and I have all of the books right here. Yeah, I just happen to have them all here on a shelf next to me. So yeah, these are the books, and I talked about them in a previous video, which I'll link below. Sarah Hall also recommends the recently reissued novel Mrs. Caliban by Rachel Ingalls, which I've been really wanting to reread because I read this when I was in my early 20s and absolutely loved it. She says Rachel Ingalls' work is a work of true verve and imagination. Along with her suburban housewife and lab-tested reptilian lover, Ingalls deftly, wittily, and rather incredibly liberates readers from the awfulness of convention to a state where weirdness and otherness are beautiful and right. That is such a excellent way of describing this novel, which is so unique. Caleb Azumah Nelson, who wrote the wonderful debut novel Open Water, has a recommendation as well. I believe he also has a new book out next year, which is really exciting. And he says, I loved Transcendent Kingdom. Yes, I loved it too. By Ya Gyasi, the story of a family of 4 who travel from Guyana to Alabama to make a new life for themselves. Through the course of the novel, the family's history begins to unfold, illuminating stories that have gone unspoken for generations. It's a beautiful novel with not a word out of place. Yeah, that is so right. He continues that I also really enjoyed Vanessa Onwuemuzi's Dark Neighborhood, a collection of short stories from an unforgettable, searing voice. They occupy a hallucinatory landscape, often veering into the surreal, and each pulses with an electric energy. I had started reading the short story collection, but just couldn't really quite get into it. I think I needed to be in the right mood, so I do want to try it again. Lauren Groff, the author of Matrix, has some recommendations as well, and she starts with Patricia Lockwood. I can't escape Patricia Lockwood, can I? And so she describes this as hilarious and subversive, and that no one is talking about this sent me reeling. Everything about this book, from its structure to its prose to the way it hits a reader unawares in the second half, is a testament to Lockwood's wicked genius. She also recommends Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch by Rivka Galchen, which is a novel I keep hearing about through these recommended lists, and one that now I increasingly really want to read. She says, flew a bit under the radar, but it is a wise meditation on the kind of hysterical scapegoating we so often see in the age of the internet, though based on a historical fact that the mother of astronomer Johannes Kepler was once accused of witchcraft. I hadn't heard that about this book. That's so interesting. She says, I loved this book intensely when I read it in this summer and have thought of it nearly every day through this strange autumn. And she also says, I've been thinking deeply about anagogical literature recently, and very few living writers write so achingly toward God as Kaveh Akbar. Real faith, Akbar writes in Pilgrim Bell, passes first through the body like an arrow. Each of the poems in this collection finds its target. And I remember reading about this poetry collection in another list, and it sounds excellent. Sanjeev Sahoda, author of the wonderful novel China Room, also has a couple of recommendations. He says, Barbara Ehrenreich is an incisive diagnostician of societies, and in Had I Known collected essays, she is clear-eyed on the ways in which the American working class has been politically abandoned and culturally demonized. Much of the analysis applies to our own country. On the novel front, I could not recommend more strongly Gwendolyn Riley's My Phantoms, which he describes as flinty, bracing, exquisite. And like I said in a previous video, this is a novel I've been avoiding because I disliked Gwendolyn Riley's novel First Love so much. Then there are some recommendations posted from authors on iNews, and which are really interesting selection because I think the authors they pick are especially interesting, but also they have a fun way of structuring it where they ask the author to give a book recommendation and then a book that they want for Christmas. So that's a really fun way to put it of books that these authors want to read, which is sometimes more interesting than hearing about what they've actually read. So first off, starting with Natasha Brown, who wrote the amazing debut novel Assembly, and her book of the year is Asylum Road by Olivia Sudjic, which is a novel I also read at the beginning of the year and I thought was excellent. She says that through a series of tense journeys and a close-up portrait of a relationship on the rocks, the novel creates an eerily familiar reflection of our current moment, one of my first reads of the year, but it continues to haunt me. And the book she wants for Christmas is something by Thomas Hardy. I've only ever read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but after driving through the luscious green hills of Hardy's Wessex a few weeks ago, I've been inspired to read more, which is interesting because earlier this year I drove through Thomas Hardy country as well, and it was really inspiring to see the whole setting of these novels. The wonderful author Sari Hustvedt, her book of the year is one I've not heard of before. It is White Hot Light, 25 Years in Emergency Medicine by Frank Haller. It may be from last year, but it shines out as one of the best books for our time of multiple emergencies. And the book she wants for Christmas is the folio edition of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I have been reading a crummy paperback for years, and I love that. And I don't have the Folio Society edition of Wuthering Heights, but I do have the one for the Tenet of Wildfell Hall. And of course, the Folio Society editions are so beautiful. I mean, look at this. Tori Peters also has some recommendations, author of Detransition Baby, one of my favorite books of this year. Her book of the year is Jackie S.'s Daryl. The Adventures of a Cuckold Fetishist Coming to Know Himself is part picaresque, part philosophy, part cultural criticism, and entirely hilarious and heartbreaking. And what she wants for Christmas, she says, when people discuss writing about gender, they often mean books by queer writers. But ever since the best-selling Out-Stealing Horses, I've thought the Norwegian writer Per Pedersen, but you probably pronounce that differently, don't you? Writes about masculinity as well as anyone. Imagine Hemingway without the preening. His new novel, Men in My Situation, is now available in the UK, but not yet in the US where I live, and I'm jealous. So that's a book I should go out and get, isn't it? Because I'm here in the UK. And finally, Maggie Shipstead gives her recommendation, which I think it's really funny that she says, I haven't been a big Franzen head in the past, but I was blown away by the depth of thought and empathy and the clarity of expression in Crossroads. So yeah, another recommendation for Crossroads. And what she wants for Christmas, she says, I think there's something fun about getting a cookbook for Christmas, and I totally agree with that. And I've heard amazing things about the expansive, inclusive Black food edited by Bryant Terry, which is the first I've heard about that book. So I'll have to look that up. So those are all the author recommendations I'm going to point out. Like I said, there's lots more author recommendations, and if you want to read more of their thoughts about any of these books, yeah, I'll put links below to these 3 different articles, and I'm sure there have been more. I'd love to find more articles like this. If you've come across some articles with authors recommending their best books of the year, please put them in the comments below, because yeah, I'd love to have a look at them. But thank you for watching this, and yeah, lots and lots more recommendations from this, and yeah, so I'm gonna keep looking through these lists, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.